When Jake Rodriguez found his younger brother Michael sleeping under a highway overpass, bruised and beaten by thugs who targeted the homeless, he made one phone call. Michael was a decorated Marine who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, earned a Bronze Star, saving 3 soldiers under fire. Now he was living on the streets while the VA had him on a 6-month waiting list. The city wanted to arrest him for vagrancy. The shelters were full. The system had abandoned him completely. By dawn, 200 Hell's Angels surrounded City Hall, engines rumbling, demanding answers. The mayor thought he could ignore
This is a
one
critical
struggling
decision
veteran.
point for our
He was about to
strategy
learn
moving
that some
forward.
brothers don't get left behind. Before we go any further, I want to ask something of you. If this story touches your heart, if you believe our veterans deserve better than broken promises, would you consider hitting that like button? And if you think stories like this need to be told, that the truth matters more than comfort, subscribe to this channel. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us tell these stories that matter, stories about real people standing up when systems fail. Thank you for being here. This isn't a story about charity. This is a story about what happens when the country forgets the people who fought for it. And the only ones who remember are the ones society taught you to fear. Jake Rodriguez was 42 years old on that Thursday evening in late October when his world tilted on its axis. He'd spent the day like he spent most days, covered in grease and oil at the motorcycle repair shop he owned on the east side of the city, hands deep in engines, solving problems that had clear solutions and predictable outcomes. There was something honest about mechanical work, something that made sense in a way the rest of the world often didn't. You diagnosed the problem, you fixed it, and the machine ran the way it was supposed to run. The sun was setting as Jake drove home in his pickup truck, the kind of amber October light that made everything look softer than it really was. He was tired in that good way that comes from physical work, already thinking about the beer waiting in his fridge and maybe catching the end of the football game. The I-95 overpass loomed ahead, the same route he'd taken home 5 days a week for the past decade, so familiar he barely registered it anymore. That's when he saw them. 3 teenagers, maybe 16 or 17 years old, circling something under the overpass. Their body language told Jake everything he needed to know. The way they moved, aggressive and predatory. The way they were laughing. That particular kind of cruelty that comes easy when you're young and stupid and operating in a pack. One of them kicked at something on the ground, and Jake's gut clenched. He didn't think about it. Didn't weigh options or consider consequences. He just pulled his truck on his shoulder, gravel crunching under his tires, and stepped out. At 6'2" with arms covered in ink and a leather vest that announced his allegiance to the Hells Angels, Jake Rodriguez wasn't someone most people wanted to confront. The teenagers took one look at him approaching and scattered like roaches when the light comes on. Their bravado evaporating the moment they faced someone who could actually fight back. Jake watched them run, then turned his attention to what they'd been kicking. A man, curled on the ground in the fetal position, arms wrapped around his head for protection. Homeless, clearly. The kind of person most drivers passed without really seeing. Another piece of urban background noise that you trained yourself to ignore because acknowledging it meant acknowledging problems too big for any one person to solve. Jake moved closer, his boots crunching on the broken glass and debris that littered the space under the overpass. The man was wearing torn military fatigues, the digital camouflage pattern faded and stained, but still recognizable. Dog tags hung around his neck, catching the last of the daylight. Something about the shape of his shoulders, the way he was curled up, triggered a memory Jake couldn't quite place. "Hey man," Jake said, his voice gentler than his appearance suggested. "They're gone. You okay?" The man didn't respond immediately, just stayed curled tight like he was still bracing for the next kick. Jake crouched down, bringing himself to eye level, and that's when he saw the face. Even swollen and bruised, even covered in dirt and weeks of beard growth, even hollowed out by hunger and whatever demons had been eating him from the inside, Jake knew that face. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his vision tunnel. "Michael." His voice cracked on the name. "Oh God, Mikey, is that you?" Michael Rodriguez, 28 years old, former United States Marine, opened his eyes and looked at his older brother. The shame in that look was worse than any of the visible injuries. Worse than the fresh bruises blooming purple across his cheekbone. Worse than the split lip still bleeding. worse than the way he was holding his ribs like they might be broken. "I'm sorry, Jake," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "I didn't want you to see me like this." Jake's hands were shaking as he reached out, as gentle as he'd ever been with anything in his life, helping his little brother sit up. Michael winced with every movement. Pain etched across features that Jake remembered as young and confident and full of that particular swagger that Marines carry. That man was gone, replaced by this hollow-eyed stranger who flinched at loud noises and couldn't hold eye contact. "I've been looking for you," Jake said, and the words came out choked with emotion he'd spent 42 years learning to control. 3 months, Mikey. 3 months I've been looking everywhere for you." Michael was wearing the same uniform he'd probably been discharged in, digital camouflage that had once been crisp and professional, now torn and filthy beyond recognition. The dog tags around his neck bore his name, his service number, his blood type. Oh, positive. Jake knew because he had the same blood type, the same tags from his own service. Those had been relegated to a drawer years ago. He hadn't bathed in weeks, maybe longer. His hair was matted, his beard unkempt, and the smell of street life clung to him. A combination of sweat and dirt and the particular odor of someone who'd been sleeping rough. But worse than any of the physical degradation was the look in Michael's eyes. Defeated. Hopeless. Like he'd already given up on the idea that things could ever get better. Jake helped him to his feet, feeling how thin his brother had become, how the muscle that Marine training had built had wasted away to almost nothing. Michael stood maybe 5'10", had always been the smaller brother, but now he felt fragile in a way that made Jake's chest tight with fear and rage. "What happened to you?" Jake asked, though he already knew parts of the answer. Michael had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, had come home different in ways that families never quite understand until it's too late. Jake had served 1 tour himself in the Marines, back in the early 2000s, before an IED had sent him home with a Purple Heart and a limp he'd eventually learned to hide. He knew what combat did to a man. Knew about the nightmares that didn't stop just because you were stateside. Knew about the way loud noises could send you diving for cover, even years after the last bullet had been fired in your direction. Michael wouldn't answer, just kept his eyes down, kept flinching every time a car passed overhead on the interstate. His hands were shaking, and Jake couldn't tell if it was from fear or withdrawal or just the accumulated damage of 3 months on the streets. Jake looked around at the space under the overpass that had apparently been Michael's home. A dirty sleeping bag, a backpack with what looked like all his worldly possessions, empty food containers, a collection of bottles that Jake didn't want to examine too closely. This was where a decorated United States Marine had been living while Jake had been going about his comfortable life just miles away. "Come on," Jake said, putting his arm around Michael's shoulders, feeling him stiffen at the contact before gradually relaxing. "We're getting you out of here. We're going to get you help." Michael laughed, and the sound was bitter and broken. "There is no help, Jake. I've tried. Believe me, I've tried." But Jake wasn't listening to that. Couldn't listen to that. Because if he accepted that there was no help, that meant accepting that his little brother was going to die under this overpass or another one just like it. Another casualty of wars that people back home tried hard not to think about. As Jake helped Michael toward his truck, supporting most of his brother's weight, a memory surfaced. Michael at 18, signing his enlistment papers with that cocky grin, so sure he was going to be a hero. Michael in his dress blues at their mother's funeral, standing at attention, the only one of them who seemed to know how to handle grief with dignity. Michael on his last leave before deployment, promising Jake he'd be careful, promising he'd come back whole. He'd come back, but he hadn't come back whole. Nobody did. Jake had been in the Marines himself, served 1 tour before an injury sent him home. He knew what combat did to a man, knew about the Brotherhood forged in fire, the bonds that civilians could never quite understand, knew about the responsibility you felt for your brothers in arms, the weight of every soldier who didn't make it home, the guilt of surviving when others didn't. But what he didn't know yet, what he was about to discover in the most brutal way possible, was that the system designed to help veterans like Michael had been systematically failing them for years. The VA backlog, the shelter shortages, the bureaucratic maze that veterans had to navigate just to get the benefits they'd earned, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't oversight. It was design. And the people responsible for that design, the administrators and politicians who'd built a system that counted on veterans giving up before they got help, who'd created waiting lists that stretched for months while men and women who'd served their country slept on streets and under bridges. Those people were about to face a reckoning they never saw coming. Because Jake Rodriguez might have left the Marines, but he'd never stopped being a Marine. And Marines had a code that superseded politics and bureaucracy and all the comfortable excuses that people made for inaction. No man left behind. If you've ever known a veteran struggling to get the help they earned, you understand what Jake felt in that moment. The helplessness, the rage, the desperate need to fix something that feels too big to fix. Stay with me, because what happened next forced an entire city to confront how it treats the heroes it claims to honor. But Michael hadn't always been homeless. 3 months earlier, he'd been trying to rebuild his life. The story Jake pieced together over the next few hours, sitting in an emergency room waiting area while doctors examined his brother, was a familiar one. Depressingly familiar. The kind of story that played out in cities across America every single day, with only the names and faces changing while the pattern remained exactly the same. Michael had been discharged from the Marines 8 months prior with a PTSD diagnosis. Not a surprising diagnosis for someone who'd served 2 tours in Helmand Province, who'd seen friends torn apart by IEDs, who'd been part of operations that left scars no medical exam could measure. The discharge had been honorable, with commendations that included a Bronze Star for valor. Michael Rodriguez had saved 3 fellow Marines during an ambush in Kandahar, had laid down suppressing fire while dragging wounded men to safety, had done everything right by every measure that mattered in combat. But combat skills don't translate to civilian life. Heroism under fire doesn't help you navigate the civilian job market or make the nightmares stop or convince your nervous system that the war is actually over. Jake had helped Michael get set up. Found him a small apartment, nothing fancy but clean and affordable. Helped him land a job at a warehouse, steady work with decent pay and benefits. It had seemed like Michael was going to be okay, was going to be one of the success stories instead of another casualty statistic. For 2 months, it worked. Michael showed up on time, did his job, kept himself mostly. But the nightmares never stopped. The panic attack started during his 3rd month. Loud noises from the warehouse machinery would send him diving for cover. The forklift backfiring sounded too much like gunfire. The enclosed spaces triggered claustrophobia that hadn't existed before Helmand Province. His supervisor, a man who'd never served and didn't understand what PTSD actually meant, had told Michael to get it together or find another job. Just like that. No accommodation, no understanding, no recognition that Michael's brain had been rewired by experiences most people couldn't imagine. Get it together or you're fired. Michael had tried. God, he tried. Didn't want to seem weak, didn't want to be the veteran who couldn't hack civilian life. He'd pushed through the panic attacks, swallowed the fear, forced himself to work through flashbacks that left him shaking and disoriented. But mental health doesn't respond to willpower the way physical injuries do. You can't just tough out PTSD the way you might push through sprained ankle. The breaking point came during a particularly bad episode. A truck backfired in the loading dock, and Michael's brain went straight back to Kandahar. He hit the ground, hands over his head, shouting warnings to Marines who weren't there anymore. His coworkers thought he was having a breakdown. His supervisor thought he was being dramatic. He was fired on the spot, escorted out of the building by security, while his coworkers watched and whispered. 8 years of military service, a Bronze Star, 2 tours in a combat zone, and none of it mattered. He was just another problem employee who couldn't do the job. Without income, the apartment became impossible. Michael couldn't pay rent, couldn't afford the deposit on a new place, even if he could find one. Within a month, he was evicted. The eviction notice gave him 30 days, but finding a new apartment required first and last month's rent plus security deposit, and Michael had exactly nothing. The warehouse job had been paycheck to paycheck. He'd applied for VA benefits and disability, filling out forms that seemed designed to confuse and discourage. The response had been form letters acknowledging his application and informing him of a 6-month waiting list for processing. 6 months. Half a year. As if rent and food and basic survival could wait half a year while bureaucrats shuffled papers. Too proud to ask Jake for help, Michael had disappeared into the streets. And Jake, who'd been busy with his own life, his own business, hadn't noticed until it was too late. By the time Jake realized Michael had stopped responding to calls and texts, by the time he drove to Michael's apartment and found it occupied by strangers, By the time panic set in and the search began, Michael had already been homeless for 2 weeks. Jake had checked everywhere, every hospital in the city, asking if they'd treated a Michael Rodriguez. Every homeless shelter, showing Michael's photo to staff who saw so many faces they all blurred together. Every police station, filing reports that went nowhere, because you can't file a missing person report for an adult who left voluntarily. He'd posted on social media, reaching out to veteran groups and outreach programs, called every VA office in the region, only to be told that patient privacy prevented them from sharing information. The responses, when they came, were always the same bureaucratic variations on a theme. The shelters, we're at capacity. Try calling back tomorrow. The police, we can't file a missing person report for an adult who left voluntarily. Has he committed a crime? The VA, he's in the system, but these things take time. Benefits processing can take 6 to 12 months. Every person watching this needs to understand the 7 bureaucratic barriers that trap homeless veterans in the system. First, the VA benefits backlog that stretches 6 to 12 months, leaving veterans without support during the most vulnerable period of transition. Second, the shortage of shelter beds, cities with thousands of homeless veterans and only hundreds of beds. Third, the lack of coordinated tracking systems, meaning veterans fall through cracks between agencies that don't communicate. Fourth, the catch-22 of needing an address to receive benefits, but needing benefits to afford an address. Fifth, the mental health treatment gap, with wait times of weeks or months for appointments. Sixth, the employment barrier of having PTSD or other service-related conditions that employers see as liabilities. And seventh, the pride and isolation that keeps veterans from asking for help until it's too late. Number 4 was the one that trapped Michael. You need an address to receive benefits, but you need benefits to afford an address. The bureaucratic loop that made homelessness a trap instead of a temporary condition. Jake had searched for 3 months. 3 months of dead ends and bureaucratic runarounds, and the growing certainty that something terrible had happened to his little brother. 3 months of guilt eating at him, wondering why he hadn't checked him more often, why he hadn't seen the signs, why he'd been so caught up in his own comfortable life that he'd let Michael slip away. Michael Rodriguez had been a decorated Marine, Bronze Star recipient for valor under fire, had saved 3 fellow soldiers during an ambush in Kandahar, laid down suppressing fire while dragging wounded men to safety, done everything his country asked of him, and more. Now he was sleeping under a bridge while administrators shuffled papers and told Jake these things take time. While the city had 2,000 homeless veterans and only 300 shelter beds designated for them. While VA processing time stretched to a year and nobody seemed to think that urgency mattered. While the gap between what veterans needed and what the system provided was so wide you could lose entire lives in it. And that's exactly what was happening. Lives were being lost in that gap. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly. A veteran here, a veteran there, dying of exposure or overdose or suicide or just giving up because the system made it so damn hard to survive that death seemed easier. 3 months of searching. 3 months of Michael living on the streets, getting sicker, getting weaker, becoming more invisible. 3 months before that random Thursday evening, when Jake happened to drive past at the right moment to see teenagers kicking someone under an overpass. What were the odds? What were the chances that Jake would be on that road at that time? That he'd notice and stop instead of driving past like everyone else did? That he'd find his brother before it was too late? Later, Jake would think about all the variables that had to align. If he'd left work 10 minutes earlier or later. If he'd taken a different route home. If those teenagers had picked a different victim. So many ways it could have gone differently. So many ways he might never have found Michael until it was too late. But he had found him. And now, sitting in that emergency room while doctors treated Michael's immediate injuries, Jake made himself a promise. This wasn't over. Finding Michael wasn't enough. Something had to change. The system that had failed his brother was failing thousands of veterans. And somebody had to force accountability. Jake didn't know it yet. But that promise would lead to 200 motorcycles surrounding City Hall and a confrontation that would change how an entire city treated its veterans. Jake got Michael to the emergency room that Thursday night, determined to get his brother the help he needed. The ER at County General was the kind of place where hope went to die slowly under fluorescent lights. Overcrowded, understaffed, filled with people whose emergencies range from genuine crises to the chronic problems of poverty that had nowhere else to go. Jake and Michael sat in the waiting room for an hour before a triage nurse called Michael's name, took vitals with efficient detachment, and sent them back to wait another hour. When they finally got into an examination room, a young doctor who looked like he'd been on shift for about 20 hours too long assessed Michael's injuries with professional competence. Broken ribs, probable concussion, severe malnutrition, dehydration, infected cuts that needed cleaning and antibiotics. All treatable. All things the ER could handle. But when Jake demanded they admit Michael for psychiatric evaluation, for the PTSD treatment he so desperately needed, the doctor's expression shifted from compassionate to carefully neutral. That particular look Jake had seen before, the one that meant you were about to run into a wall built of policy and procedure. Your brother needs long-term care, not emergency services, the doctor said, his voice kind but firm. We can treat his immediate physical injuries, but for mental health treatment, he needs to go through proper channels. The VA hospital has programs specifically for veterans. Jake had already pulled out his phone, already called the VA while sitting in the waiting room. The person who answered had been polite and sympathetic and utterly unhelpful. 3-week wait for an intake appointment. Not 3 weeks to start treatment. 3 weeks just to get evaluated to determine what treatment he might eventually qualify for. 3 weeks, Jake said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. My brother is suicidal, and you want him to wait 3 weeks for someone to decide if he deserves help. The doctor's sympathy was genuine, but useless. He didn't make the rules. He couldn't change the system. He could only do his job within the constraints he'd been given. That's when the social worker appeared. Patricia Chun, mid-40s, with the exhausted competence of someone who'd spent too many years trying to fit desperate people into inadequate systems. She had paperwork and bad news delivered in a gentle voice that somehow made it worse. The city had ordinances against vagrancy. Michael had been sleeping under public infrastructure. Technically, that was illegal. The police could cite him, and there was actually an officer in the hallway who'd been called when the ER staff realized they had a homeless patient who might need to be processed through the system. You're going to arrest a veteran for being homeless. Jake's voice rose despite his best efforts to stay calm. A few heads in nearby exam rooms turned their direction. The officer, a young guy who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, shifted his weight. I'm just doing my job, sir. He can't sleep under public infrastructure. It's a safety issue. A safety issue for who? Jake demanded. For him, getting beaten by teenagers? Or a safety issue for people who don't want to see homeless vets when they drive past? The social worker intervened before things could escalate. There are shelters, she said, consulting her list. St. Anthony's has a waiting list. Hope Harbor is full, but taking names. The VA shelter has 50 beds, but there's a 3-week wait. They're all full. Jake's control finally snapped. I've called every single one. I've spent 3 months calling every shelter, every program, every service in this city. You know what they all say? Wait, be patient. These things take time. Meanwhile, my brother is dying on the streets. And you're telling me there are shelters with waiting lists? The ER had gone quiet. Other patients were watching now, this confrontation playing out like uncomfortable theater. Patricia Chen's face showed that she knew. She knew the shelters were full. She knew the system was broken. She probably had this conversation a dozen times a week. But knowing didn't change what she could offer, which was nothing meaningful. Michael, who'd been silent through all of this, finally spoke. His voice was hollow, defeated in a way that cut Jake deeper than any anger could have. Just let them arrest me, Jake. At least in jail, I'll have a bed and 3 meals a day. At least I'll be warm. The defeat in those words. The hopelessness. The complete absence of fight. This was what the system had done to a Marine who'd earned a Bronze Star for valor. It had ground him down until jail sounded better than freedom, until incarceration seemed like an upgrade from the life he'd been living. Jake looked at his brother, really looked at him. 28 years old, but looking 50. Wearing dog tags that marked him as someone who'd served his country. Wearing a uniform that should have meant something, that should have guaranteed he'd be taken care of when he came home. And here he was, so broken by the system meant to help him that he was asking to be arrested because at least jail provided basic human necessities. The bureaucratic nightmare was laid out stark and clear. Michael needed housing, mental health treatment, disability benefits, job training, medical care for injuries both physical and psychological. What was actually available to him? A 3-week wait for a VA intake appointment, homeless shelters with waiting lists, a 6-month backlog for benefits processing, and a city ordinance that made his homelessness a crime. The gap between what he needed and what the system provided wasn't a gap. It was a chasm, an uncrossable distance built of bureaucracy and budget constraints and policies that seemed designed to make veterans give up before they got help. Jake realized something in that moment. Sitting in that emergency room, while a social worker shuffled through inadequate options, and a cop waited to cite his brother for the crime of having nowhere to sleep. The system wasn't broken. That's what people said. That's what they told themselves to feel better about the failing. The system is broken, implying it used to work and just needs repair. But this system was working exactly as designed. It was designed to move slowly, designed to have waiting lists and bureaucratic hurdles, designed to be so complicated and frustrating that people would give up, designed to make veterans wait and hope and eventually disappear into statistics that nobody wanted to look at too closely. It was designed to make the problem invisible. And the people responsible for that design, the administrators and politicians who'd built these barriers and called them help, who'd created waiting lists that stretched for months and called it serving veterans, those people were about to be forced to see the problem they'd worked so hard to hide. Jake made a choice in that hospital parking lot that would either save his brother or get him arrested. What he didn't know yet was that Michael wasn't the only veteran suffering. There were dozens of them scattered across the city, all forgotten, all waiting for help that moved too slowly to matter. And the city officials who'd allowed this to happen, who'd let federal funding sit unused while veterans died on the streets, were about to be forced to see them. If you believe veterans deserve better than this, comment "No Vet Left Behind." Because what Jake did next, it's exactly why we can't accept that bureaucracy is more important than human lives. Jake did everything right, everything the system tells you to do. And that's exactly why what happened next had to happen. Friday morning started with hope. The kind of desperate, fragile hope that comes from believing that somewhere in the labyrinth of bureaucracy, there must be someone who could help. Someone who would see a Marine veteran in crisis and understand that this couldn't wait. That Michael Rodriguez didn't have weeks or months to spend navigating waiting lists while his mental health deteriorated and his body gave out from malnutrition and untreated injuries. Jake had taken Michael home from the emergency room Thursday night, got him showered, fed him the first real meal he'd eaten in God knows how long, set him up on the couch with blankets and pillows, watched his little brother fall asleep, still clutching those dog tags like they were a lifeline to something he'd lost. And then Jake had sat at his kitchen table until dawn, making lists. Every agency that might help, every organization that claimed to serve veterans, every official channel that existed for exactly this situation. Friday morning, he started making calls. The VA regional office opened at 8. Jake was on hold by 8:02. When a representative finally picked up, her voice had that particular combination of sympathy and detachment that came from having this conversation dozens of times every day. "Your brother is in the queue," she told Jake after he'd explained the situation. "The system shows his application was received 7 months ago. He should expect to hear back within the next 90 to 120 days regarding his benefits determination. He's homeless," Jake said, fighting to keep his voice level. "He's got untreated PTSD. He was beaten unconscious 2 days ago. He can't wait another 4 months. I understand your frustration, sir, but there are thousands of veterans ahead of him in the queue. The process takes time to ensure accuracy and fairness." Next call, City Housing Authority. A tired-sounding clerk who probably dealt with desperate people all day, every day, until they all blurred together into one continuous stream of need that far exceeded available resources. "We have a 400-person waiting list for subsidized housing," she explained. "Even emergency housing has a 6-week wait. Your brother can submit an application, but I want to be realistic about the timeline. Veteran Services. We'll add him to our database. Someone will reach out within 2 to 3 weeks to assess his eligibility for programs. Congressman's office. We'll look into it. These cases can take some time to resolve, but we'll make inquiries with the appropriate agencies." Every single call ended the same way. "Wait. Be patient. The system is working. We understand your concerns. These things take time." Like time was some neutral, harmless thing instead of the enemy killing veterans one day at a time. By noon, Jake had made 14 calls and gotten 14 variations of the same useless response. Michael sat on the couch, watching Jake work through the list with an expression that said he'd been through this before, that he already knew how it would end. The hopelessness on his face was worse than anything Jake had seen in the ER. Friday night, that hopelessness manifested in ways Jake wasn't prepared for. Michael had seemed okay during dinner. Quiet, withdrawn, but Jake chalked that up to exhaustion and the trauma of the past few months. They'd watched a football game together, and for brief moments it almost felt normal, like they were just two brothers hanging out the way they used to before Afghanistan, before the war changed everything. Then a commercial came on. A car commercial. Something innocuous and forgettable. But had fireworks. Loud, explosive fireworks that sounded just enough like incoming mortars that Michael's brain couldn't tell the difference. He hit the floor so fast Jake barely registered the movement. 1 second sitting on the couch, the next second flat on the ground with his hands over his head, shouting warnings in Pashto, calling out to Marines who weren't there, weren't anywhere except in memories that refused to stay buried. Michael. Jake dropped to the floor beside him, careful not to touch him, remembering his own training about how to handle someone in a flashback. Mikey, you're home. You're safe. You're in my house in Philadelphia. There's no incoming fire. You're safe. It took 20 minutes to talk Michael back to reality. 20 minutes of Jake speaking in a calm, steady voice while his brother relived combat experiences that Jake could only imagine. When Michael finally came back, when his eyes focused and he recognized where he was, the shame on his face was devastating. I'm sorry, he whispered, his whole body shaking. I'm so sorry, Jake. That's when Jake realized. Not in 3 weeks. Not in 6 months. Michael needed professional help now. Today. This minute. Because the next flashback might not be triggered by a television commercial. The next one might happen somewhere public, somewhere that would get him arrested or institutionalized or worse. Saturday morning, Jake drove Michael to the VA Emergency Mental Health Clinic. They arrived at 7 when it opened. Checked in with a receptionist who barely looked up from her computer. Sat in a waiting room filled with other veterans, all of them wearing the same expression of resignation mixed with desperation. They waited 8 hours. 8 hours in uncomfortable plastic chairs under fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered. 8 hours watching other veterans come and go, some getting seen, others giving up and leaving. 8 hours while Michael's anxiety visibly mounted, while he started flinching at every noise, while the stress of waiting triggered smaller versions of the flashback from the night before. When they finally got called back, when Jake explained to the psychiatric nurse what had happened, when he described Michael's deterioration and his desperate need for immediate treatment, the nurse consulted her computer and delivered the verdict with practiced sympathy. We can schedule an appointment for next month, February 18th at 2 p.m. That's the earliest opening for new patient intake. Next month. Jake's control finally cracked completely. My brother had a full combat flashback last night. He's a danger to himself. He needs help now, not next month. I understand, but we're operating at capacity. Unless he's actively suicidal or homicidal, we can't admit him to inpatient care. The best I can do is this appointment and a crisis hotline number he can call if he has another episode. A crisis hotline. For a Marine who'd earned a Bronze Star, who'd served his country for 8 years, who'd done everything asked of him and more. A phone number and an appointment 4 weeks away. That's when Jake understood. The system moved slowly because it could. Because veterans had no leverage, no voice, no way to force urgency. Because the people running the system faced no consequences when veterans fell through the cracks. No administrator got fired when someone died waiting for an appointment. No politician lost their job when federal funding sat and used while people suffered. The system was designed to move slowly because moving slowly meant fewer people successfully accessing services, which meant lower costs, which meant administrators could point to balanced budgets and call it success. People died waiting for help that was perpetually processing, and the officials responsible kept their jobs, kept collecting paychecks, kept attending press conferences where they talked about their commitment to veterans while doing absolutely nothing to actually help them. What Jake didn't know yet, what would make his blood boil when he learned it, was that the city had $2.3 million in federal funding specifically for homeless veteran services. Money that had been sitting and used for 8 months, while administrators debated proper allocation protocols. While Michael and hundreds of veterans like him slept on streets and under bridges, federal money designated for their care sat in an account collecting interest, tied up in bureaucratic processes that moved at the speed of indifference. Let me explain how the VA backlog actually works, because understanding the system is the only way to fix it. There are 5 bureaucratic checkpoints every veteran has to clear, and each one is designed, intentionally or not, to make veterans give up before they get help. Checkpoint 1. Initial application. Veterans submit paperwork requesting benefits, often without understanding what documentation is required. Incomplete applications get rejected and sent back, restarting the process from zero. Checkpoint 2. Verification. The VA must verify service records, medical histories, and discharge status. This alone can take months because the VA's record-keeping systems don't communicate effectively with Department of Defense databases. Checkpoint 3. Medical evaluation. Veterans must be examined to determine the extent of their disabilities. Appointment wait times run 8 to 12 weeks in most regions. Checkpoint 4. Adjudication. A VA official reviews all documentation and makes a determination. This is where applications sit longest, sometimes for 6 months or more, because there aren't enough adjudicators to handle the volume. Checkpoint 5. Appeals. If the initial determination is unfavorable, veterans can appeal, which adds another 6 to 18 months to the process. At every checkpoint, veterans can be kicked back to the beginning for missing documentation, missed appointments, or procedural errors. The entire system is designed like a maze where wrong turns mean starting over, where patience is mandatory, but help is optional, where the complexity itself becomes the barrier. Saturday evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table again. Michael was sleeping on the couch, finally resting after Jake had convinced him he was safe here, that he didn't have to leave, that they'd figure this out together. Jake stared at his phone, at the list of useless numbers he'd called, at the appointment card for a mental health evaluation 4 weeks away that might as well have been 4 years for all the good it would do. And Jake made a decision. The system had failed his brother. Failed him completely and systematically. But Jake had another system he could call on. A brotherhood that operated outside bureaucracy, that understood loyalty, meant action, not paperwork, that knew some situations couldn't wait for proper channels and official processes. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he hadn't called in months. Thomas Garrett, known to everyone as Reaper for the past 20 years. President of Jake's Hells Angels chapter. A man who understood that when the system failed, people had to step up. That when institutions chose paperwork over people, the Brotherhood chose people every single time. Jake had called. Saturday morning, Jake sat at his kitchen table watching his brother sleep on the couch, finally resting after Jake convinced him he was safe. And Jake made a decision. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Yeah. Reaper, Jake said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. It's Jake. I need the Brotherhood. It's my brother Michael. There was a pause, but not the pause of hesitation. It was the pause of a man who'd led the Hells Angels for 15 years processing information, calculating what was needed, preparing to act. Reaper had known Jake since he prospected for the club 18 years ago. Had watched him earn his patch, become a respected member, build a business, live by the code. He knew Jake didn't ask for help lightly. Tell me, Reaper said simply. Jake told him. Not everything, not all the details that would come later, but enough. His brother Michael, Marine veteran, 2 tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star recipient, found him Thursday night under a bridge, beaten and homeless. The VA backlog, the shelter waiting lists, the system moving too slowly while Michael deteriorated. The combat flashback last night that proved his brother needed help immediately, not in 3 weeks or 6 months. When Jake finished, Reaper was quiet for a moment. Then, how many do you need? As many as will come, Jake said. For words that would change everything. We ride at dawn. After they hung up, Reaper stood in his living room, his wife watching from the kitchen doorway. She'd been married to him for 30 years, had spent most of her adult life as an old lady in the Hells Angels world, and she knew what that look on his face meant. Someone needed the Brotherhood. Marine veteran, Reaper told her, already pulling up contacts on his phone. Jake's little brother. System abandoned him. She nodded, understanding immediately. Started making coffee because she knew her husband would be making calls for hours. The Brotherhood operated on a code that outsiders rarely understood. It wasn't about lawlessness or rebellion or the stereotypes that movies love to portray. At its core, it was about loyalty, about family that transcended blood, about showing up when the people you call brother needed you. No questions asked, no hesitation. Marines had a saying that every service member knew: no man left behind. It wasn't just a motto. It was a sacred obligation, a promise that when you went into combat, your brothers would bring you home. Dead or alive, wounded or whole, nobody got left on the battlefield. The Hells Angels had the same code. Maybe they expressed it differently. Maybe they operated outside traditional systems. But the principle was identical. You protected your own. You showed up when called. You didn't abandon your brothers just because helping them was inconvenient or difficult or required sacrifice. Michael Rodriguez had served his country, had gone where his government sent him, fought the battles his politicians started, done everything asked of him with honor and courage. And his country had abandoned him, left him to navigate a bureaucratic nightmare alone, let him fall through cracks wide enough to swallow lives whole, turned its back on the promises made when he'd signed those enlistment papers. The Brotherhood wouldn't. Reaper made his first call to Marcus Hammer Thompson, the club's vice president, then to Johnny Chain Morrison, the road captain who organized rides and knew every chapter president within 500 miles. Then he started working through the regional network, chapter presidents across 4 states, men who led their own brotherhoods and understood that this wasn't just about one veteran, it was about all of them. The message spread like wildfire through digital networks and phone trees. Marine veteran abandoned by the system that sent him to war. Brother of one of our own. Riding to City Hall Sunday morning to demand accountability. Bring everyone. In Philadelphia, Tommy Hammer Martinez read the message at 10 Saturday night. He was 48 years old, ran a construction company, had a wife and 3 kids, and a mortgage and all the trappings of respectable civilian life. He also had a patch that said he was Hells Angels and scars from Fallujah that said he was Army infantry. Tommy had been homeless himself after Iraq. Came home in 2005 with a traumatic brain injury and PTSD that made holding a job nearly impossible. Spent 18 months living in his car, sometimes under bridges, navigating the same VA backlog that was failing Michael Rodriguez now. It had taken him 2 years to get disability benefits, 2 years of fighting the system while trying to survive on streets that didn't care about his service record or his sacrifice. He stared at the message for exactly 10 seconds. Then he called his construction crew. We're riding tomorrow. Family emergency. Anyone who can make it. Meet at the clubhouse at 6 a.m. His foreman protested. They had a job scheduled for Sunday, overtime pay, a deadline that was already tight. Tommy listened politely, then said he wouldn't be there and hung up. Some things mattered more than construction deadlines. A Marine veteran needed help, and Tommy remembered what it felt like to need help and find only closed doors and waiting lists. Not on my watch, he told his wife as he checked his motorcycle in the garage. Not to another vet. In Baltimore, Sarah, widow, Chun got the message during her night shift at the VA hospital where she worked as a psychiatric nurse. She was 35, one of the few female Hells Angels in the chapter, and someone who saw the broken system from the inside every single day. Sarah had served in the Navy, spent 3 years on a hospital ship in the Persian Gulf patching up Marines and soldiers and sailors who'd been torn apart by war. She'd come home thinking she'd continue serving veterans by working in the VA system. Instead, she'd found a bureaucratic nightmare where good intentions were strangled by red tape and insufficient resources. She saw veterans like Michael Rodriguez every shift. Saw them wait 8 hours for appointments that lasted 15 minutes. Saw them get prescribed medications without adequate follow-up. Saw them fall through cracks because there weren't enough beds, enough therapists, enough time or money or give a damn from the administrators who ran the system. She knew the backlog wasn't accidental. Knew about the unused funding sitting in accounts while veterans suffered. Knew that every time she raised concerns about wait times or inadequate care, she was told to work within the system, to be patient, to understand that change took time. Count me in, she texted back. Someone needs to make them accountable. In a quiet suburb outside Wilmington, Delaware, Robert Preacher, Williams read the message and felt 60 years fall away. He was 58 now, walked with a cane from a leg injury he'd gotten in Vietnam in 1968, hadn't ridden more than 100 miles in 5 years because the pain got too bad. But Preacher remembered coming home from Vietnam to protesters calling him baby killer, spitting on his uniform, treating him like a criminal instead of a veteran. Remembered going to the VA in 1969 with nightmares and flashbacks and being told that Vietnam vets were faking PTSD to get benefits, that there was no such thing as combat trauma, that he just needed to man up and get over it. 54 years later, veterans were still fighting the same battles, still being told to wait, to be patient, to work within systems designed to fail them. The names changed, the wars changed, but the bureaucratic betrayal remained exactly the same. Preacher looked at his cane, at his bad leg that ached in cold weather, at the bottle of pain medication on his nightstand. Looked at the message on his phone about a Marine veteran who'd saved 3 soldiers in Kandahar and was now homeless because the system had abandoned him. Some fights are worth the pain, he told his wife as he pulled his riding gear from the closet where it had been gathering dust. She helped him pack water and sandwiches, made sure he had his medications, kissed him goodbye at the door. 40 years of marriage meant she knew better than to try to stop him. Some things mattered more than comfort or safety, or the doctor's recommendations about limiting physical stress. Across 4 states, the same scene repeated with variations. Men and women made impossible choices, prioritized a stranger's desperate need over their own comfort and convenience. They checked motorcycles that had been sitting idle, pulled leather vests from closets, kissed confused family members goodbye, and started riding to a city most of them had never visited to support a veteran they'd never met. What Reaper had expected would be maybe 75 riders had grown into something else entirely. By midnight Saturday, chapter presidents were reporting numbers that kept climbing. 60 confirmed from Pennsylvania. By 2 Sunday morning, 80 from New Jersey. By 4, 50 from Maryland. By 5, 110 from New York. And the messages kept coming, kept confirming, kept adding to a total that was growing beyond anything Reaper had anticipated. The text chains took on a life of their own. Photos of bikes being prepped in garages and driveways. Screenshots of GPS routes, all converging on the same destination. Messages of solidarity and shared purpose. For every veteran, the system failed. For the brothers and sisters who came home but never really made it home. For Michael Rodriguez and every Marine like him. Drop your city and state in the comments right now. Let's see how far this message reaches. Because this story, it happened in a city just like yours, to a veteran who could be your neighbor, your family member, your friend. The energy building across those digital connections was electric. This wasn't just about one Marine anymore, though Michael remained at the heart of it. This was about every time the system had failed, every time administrators had chosen budgets over people, every time good intentions had been strangled by bureaucracy while veterans suffered and died, waiting for help that never came. As dawn approached Sunday morning, hundreds of headlights cut through darkness on highways across the eastern seaboard. Interstate 95 southbound and northbound, Interstate 76, the New Jersey Turnpike, smaller state routes and back roads. All of them pointed toward the same destination. All of them carrying riders who'd sacrificed comfort and time and money to make a statement that couldn't be ignored. By 5:30 Sunday morning, Reaper realized they weren't looking at 75 riders. They were looking at 200, possibly more. The response had exceeded every expectation, had grown into something that would be impossible to dismiss or ignore, impossible to bury in press releases and bureaucratic double talk. And in the city, in a modest house where Michael Rodriguez slept peacefully for the first time in months because his brother had promised he was safe, Mayor Richard Carlson was preparing for what he thought would be a routine Sunday morning press conference, completely unaware that his carefully scripted day was about to be shattered by a reckoning 200 motorcycles strong. While 200 motorcycles roared through the pre-dawn darkness, Mayor Richard Carlson was preparing for a quiet Sunday. City Hall was normally closed on Sundays. The building sat empty and silent, a monument to municipal governance that only came alive during business hours when staff filled offices and citizens came with complaints and requests, and the thousand small problems that city governments existed to address. But today was special. Today, Mayor Carlson had scheduled a press conference for 10 in the morning, a carefully orchestrated event designed to remind voters that their elected officials cared about the community, that tax dollars were being spent wisely, that the city was moving forward with purpose and vision. The occasion was the opening of Eisenhower Memorial Park, a new green space on the north side, named after the World War II general. 3 acres of grass and playgrounds and walking paths that had cost $2.7 million in municipal bonds. The mayor's communications director had prepared talking points about honoring veterans, about creating spaces for families, about the city's commitment to quality of life improvements. The irony was lost on exactly no one who actually paid attention. A park named after a general, while 2,000 veterans slept on the streets. Memorial benches dedicated to military service while the VA backlog stretched to a year. Photo opportunities celebrating those who'd served while federal funding for homeless veterans sat unused in city accounts. But Mayor Carlson didn't think in terms of irony. He thought in terms of optics and messaging and poll numbers. The park opening would get positive press. The photos of him cutting a ribbon at a facility named after a military hero would play well with voters. The talking points about honoring service would check important boxes without requiring actual follow-through or accountability. At 7 Sunday morning, Patricia Helms, the city's director of Veterans Affairs, was in her office reviewing notes for the press conference. She prepared a brief statement about the city's various programs for veterans, carefully worded to sound comprehensive without actually committing to anything specific. Vague references to partnerships and initiatives and ongoing efforts that meant nothing concrete, but sounded impressive when read quickly by reporters on deadline. Patricia knew about the unused federal funding, knew about the shelter bed shortage and the VA backlog, and the gaps in services that left veterans falling through cracks. She'd raised concerns about it in budget meetings, had been told that proper protocols required extensive review before funds could be allocated, that rushing the process would create liability issues, that patience was necessary to ensure optimal outcomes. $2.3 million sitting unused for 8 months while she wrote statements about the city's commitment to veterans. The cognitive dissonance should have been unbearable, but Patricia had learned to compartmentalize, to separate what she knew from what she could acknowledge, to survive in a system that punished honesty and rewarded careful ambiguity. The city manager, David Shun, was reviewing budget reports in the conference room, preparing for quarterly presentations that would happen later in the week. Numbers that showed balanced budgets and fiscal responsibility. Federal grants received and allocated according to proper procedures. Nothing in those reports mentioned that allocation didn't mean distribution, that money could sit in accounts indefinitely while administrators debated protocols. At 8 Sunday morning, the security guard unlocked City Hall's main entrance. Frank Rodriguez, no relation to Jake or Michael, was 63 and 3 years from retirement. Former Army, served in Desert Storm, now spent his days monitoring a building that was mostly empty and rarely exciting. Frank did his morning rounds, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was secure before staff started arriving for the press conference setup. Everything was routine, predictable, exactly as it should be. He poured himself coffee from the thermos he'd brought, settled into his chair at the security desk, and pulled out the newspaper. At 8:15, Frank noticed 3 motorcycles parked across the street from City Hall. Not unusual necessarily. People park there all the time. But the riders weren't getting off their bikes, weren't walking away. They were just standing there, arms crossed, watching the building. By 8:30, there were 20 motorcycles. Riders in leather vests with patches Frank recognized from his years monitoring public gatherings. Hell's Angels. More concerning was that many of them were wearing military insignia alongside their club patches. Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force. Veterans, Frank realized. Veterans who were organizing for some purpose he didn't yet understand. By 8:45, there were 50 motorcycles surrounding City Hall Plaza, all of them positioned strategically around entrances and exits, all staying on public property, not crossing any legal boundaries, but their presence impossible to ignore. Frank called his supervisor, a note of concern creeping into his usually calm voice. "We have a situation developing," he said, watching more bikes arrive, even as he spoke. "I think you need to get the mayor down here." Mayor Carlson arrived at City Hall at 9, earlier than he'd planned, summoned by increasingly urgent calls from his staff. He stood at the window of his office, looking down at the plaza below, trying to understand what he was seeing. The press conference talking points were still on his desk. Commitment to veterans, honoring those who served, creating community spaces for families. Words that had seemed so reasonable when his communications director wrote them, so focus-grouped and poll-tested and safe. Now, those words felt hollow, watching dozens of veterans on motorcycles surrounding his building. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't controlled or predicted or manageable through carefully crafted statements. What do they want? He asked his chief of staff, as if she would somehow have answers. We don't know yet, sir. They haven't approached the building or made any demands. They're just there, standing silent, watching, waiting, and more kept arriving. Mayor Carlson had 45 minutes left before his carefully scripted day exploded. But first, let me tell you what was about to arrive at City Hall, because it wasn't just Jake and Michael. At 9 on Sunday morning, the sound started. It began as a vibration that rattled City Hall windows, a rumble you could feel in your chest before your brain could identify what was causing it. Then it grew louder, closer, unmistakable. The main force was arriving, and the sound was like rolling thunder, like an approaching storm that you couldn't escape or ignore. 200 motorcycles roared down Market Street toward City Hall. Their engines created a unified symphony of power that shook the ground and set off car alarms for blocks. This wasn't a parade. This wasn't a casual Sunday ride. This was a formation, organized with military precision. Every rider knowing exactly where to position, exactly what role to play. They moved like a unit because many of them were units. Veterans who'd served together, who understood tactical positioning, who knew how to create presence without creating threat. They surrounded City Hall Plaza from all sides, parking in perfect formation around every entrance and exit, staying on public property, maintaining legal boundaries, but making it absolutely clear that they weren't going anywhere. As each motorcycle settled into position, the engines cut off one by one, creating a spreading silence that was somehow more powerful than the noise had been. 200 riders dismounted and stood beside their bikes, arms crossed, faces set with determination. The message needed no words. We're here. We're watching. You'll answer for this. The visual was striking in ways that cameras couldn't fully capture. Many riders wore their Hells Angels patches, but alongside the club insignia were military decorations. Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force. Service branch, patches worn with the same pride as the club colors. Some riders were in wheelchairs, bikes specially modified for disabled veterans. Ages ranged from 25 to 75, from recent Afghanistan deployments to Vietnam veterans who'd been fighting the VA for 50 years. Silver Star recipients stood next to Bronze Star recipients. Combat veterans from Fallujah beside veterans from Kandahar, beside veterans from Da Nang. All united by one code that transcended service branch or generation. No veteran left behind. Jake had brought Michael, wanted him to see this, needed him to understand that he wasn't alone, that his struggle mattered, that people cared enough to ride through the night to stand with him. They parked at the front of the formation, and as Michael climbed off the bike, he looked at the sea of riders and veterans, and his face transformed. Tears streamed down his cheeks. They came for me. His voice broke on the words. But they don't even know me. Jake put his hand on his brother's shoulder. They know you're a Marine. That's enough. And that was the code. That was the Brotherhood. You didn't need to know someone's name or their story or their specific struggles. That was enough to mobilize 200 people to ride through darkness and sacrifice their Sunday and stand in formation demanding accountability. The crowd kept growing. News vans arrived within 10 minutes, reporters and camera operators spilling out, immediately recognizing that whatever was happening here was a story that would lead the evening news. A helicopter appeared overhead, news cameras capturing aerial footage of 200 motorcycles in perfect formation surrounding City Hall. But more significantly, other veterans started showing up. Not bikers, just vets who'd heard through the grapevine or seen early morning news reports or felt that pull that veterans have when they hear one of their own needs support. They came on foot, in cars, on public transportation. Homeless veterans from camps under nearby overpasses, walking to City Hall because they understood this demonstration was about them too, about all the forgotten ones the system had abandoned. 200 bikers became 300 people, then 350. A growing crowd of veterans, their families, their supporters, all gathering to bear witness to institutional failure. The police response was significant but measured. 15 officers arrived to monitor the situation, coordinating with department leadership about how to handle this. But Police Chief Marcus Wren, himself a Navy veteran, took one look at the formation and made a decision. No laws are being broken, he told his officers. Peaceful assembly on public property. Veterans exercising their First Amendment rights. We monitor, we maintain safety, but we let them make their point. Some of his officers looked relieved. Others looked uncertain. But Chief Wren understood something that Mayor Carlson didn't yet grasp. You don't disperse a peaceful assembly of veterans demanding accountability for institutional failures. Not without making the situation infinitely worse. Not without confirming everything they were there to protest. I want you to understand something. What Jake did that morning, bringing 200 bikers to demand accountability, it wasn't about intimidation. It wasn't about causing problems or creating chaos. It was about making invisible veterans visible, about forcing a system that thrived on hiding its failures to face them in public, about proving that when institutions fail, when bureaucracies choose paperwork over people, regular citizens have to become the institution. At 9:30, Mayor Richard Carlson walked out of City Hall to give his press conference about Eisenhower Memorial Park. He expected to cut a ribbon, make a statement about honoring veterans, pose for photos that would run in tomorrow's newspaper. He expected routine, control, positive coverage. Instead, he found 200 bikers and 100 homeless veterans waiting for answers. Mayor Richard Carlson stepped to the podium set up on the City Hall steps, his prepared speech about Eisenhower Memorial Park suddenly feeling absurdly irrelevant. The ribbon-cutting ceremony, the carefully staged photo opportunities, the talking points about honoring veterans, all of it rendered meaningless by the sea of leather and chrome and silent determination spread out before him. 300 people filled the plaza. 200 motorcycles gleamed in the morning sun. News cameras were positioned at multiple angles, capturing everything. This wasn't the controlled media event his communications director had planned. This was something else entirely. Something that couldn't be managed with prepared statements and carefully worded deflections. Jake and Reaper walked forward through the crowd, Michael between them. The assembly parted to let them through, creating a path that led directly to the podium where the mayor stood frozen. Every step felt weighted with purpose, with the accumulated frustration of 3 months searching, of bureaucratic runarounds, of watching his brother suffer while administrators shuffled papers. Jake stopped 10 feet from the mayor, looked him directly in the eyes. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, but it carried across the plaza, amplified by the absolute silence of 300 people listening. Mr. Mayor, my name is Jake Rodriguez. This is my brother Michael. He's a decorated Marine who served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He earned a Bronze Star saving 3 soldiers under fire during an ambush in Kandahar. 3 months ago, he became homeless because the system you oversee failed him completely. Carlson opened his mouth to respond, but Jake continued, his words hitting like hammer blows. I found him Thursday night under the I-95 overpass, beaten unconscious by teenagers, malnourished, suffering from untreated PTSD, wearing the same uniform he was discharged in 8 months ago. Your city wanted to arrest him for vagrancy. Your shelters were all full. Your VA office told him to wait 6 months for benefits. The emergency mental health clinic told him to wait 3 weeks for an appointment. The system you're responsible for told my brother, a Marine who fought for this country, to wait while he died slowly on your streets. Michael stepped forward then. This was the first time he'd spoken publicly about his struggle, the first time he'd put words to the shame and fear and hopelessness that had consumed him. His voice shook, but determination steadied it. I applied for VA benefits 8 months ago, Michael said, and 300 people listened in absolute silence. I'm still waiting. I tried to get into shelters. Every single one told me they were at capacity. I tried to get mental health care. They gave me an appointment 3 weeks away, while I was having combat flashbacks that made me a danger to myself. I tried to survive on the streets, got beaten by teenagers while your city wanted to cite me for illegal camping. I served my country for 8 years. Did everything asked of me. And when I came home broken, the country I served abandoned me. The mayor started to speak, started to offer the kind of sympathetic platitudes that politicians deploy when confronted with uncomfortable truths. But before he could, other veterans stepped forward from the crowd. One by one, they walked to the front, positioned themselves beside Michael, added their voices to his. Carlos Mendez, 34, Army veteran, stepped up first. His voice was steady, resigned to a reality he'd been living for over a year. I've been on a housing waiting list for 14 months, Carlos said. I sleep in my car in the Walmart parking lot. I have a job. I work 40 hours a week as a security guard, but I can't afford rent in this city. Can't save enough for first and last month's rent plus deposit. The city has empty buildings sitting vacant, but there's no funding to convert them to veteran housing. So I sleep in my car and hope the police don't cite me for that too. Jennifer Watson, 29, Air Force veteran, was next. She looked young until you saw her eyes, saw the exhaustion and pain etched there. I have a traumatic brain injury from an IED in Afghanistan, she said. Can't work full-time because I get debilitating headaches, confusion, memory problems. My disability claim has been processing for 11 months. 11 months. I live in a tent behind the grocery store on 5th Street. The manager lets me stay there because he's a veteran too, because he understands that the system fails us, and sometimes civilians have to pick up the slack. Raymond Doc Foster, 52, Navy corpsman who'd served as a medic in Desert Storm, stepped forward with the bearing of a man who'd spent decades patching up wounded soldiers, who knew trauma for both sides. I saved lives in the desert, Doc said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades. Combat medic. Patched up Marines and soldiers under fire. Now I can't get medical care for myself because the VA clinic is overwhelmed with a 6-month wait for appointments. The city clinic won't take veterans without insurance. I have diabetes that's going untreated. High blood pressure that's going untreated. I'm dying slowly because the medical system I once served can't be bothered to serve me back. The pattern was unmistakable. Each veteran had applied for help through proper channels. Each had been told to wait, to be patient, to trust the system. Each had fallen through cracks that weren't accidents, but design features. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended, filtering out veterans through bureaucratic attrition until only the most persistent or the most connected managed to navigate the maze successfully. Mayor Carlson looked desperately at Patricia Helms, his director of Veterans Affairs, silently pleading for her to fix this, to explain this, to make it go away. Patricia stepped forward, her prepared talking points feeling pathetic in the face of this testimony. The city is committed to serving our veterans, she began, but a voice from the crowd cut her off. Why is there $2.3 million in federal funding sitting unused? The question came from Sarah Widochin, the Hells Angels nurse who worked at the VA hospital, who knew exactly where the money was and why it hadn't been distributed. Patricia's face paled. This wasn't supposed to be public knowledge. The funding was supposed to be an internal matter, something discussed in budget meetings and administrative reviews, not exposed to news cameras and angry veterans. We're developing proper protocols for distribution, Patricia said, the words sounding hollow, even to her own ears. Federal grants require careful planning to ensure optimal allocation and accountability. Jake's voice cut through the bureaucratic doublespeak like a knife. Developing protocols? Veterans are dying on the streets while you develop protocols? You've had 8 months to develop protocols. How long does it take to decide that homeless veterans need housing and mental health care? Reaper stepped forward then, his presence commanding in a way that made the mayor take an involuntary step backward. It's not complex, Reaper said, his voice deadly quiet. You have money designated for homeless veterans. There are homeless veterans right here. Give them the damn money. It's not a protocol issue. It's a priority issue. And you've made it clear that veterans aren't your priority. The news cameras captured everything. The mayor's discomfort, Patricia's deflections, the veterans standing together, bearing witness to institutional failure. This wasn't a story that could be buried in a back-page brief or explained away with carefully worded press releases. This was the lead story, the kind of visual that would play on loop, that would force uncomfortable conversations. What came next would shock everyone. A city employee stepped forward, a whistleblower who'd been afraid to speak up until this moment. What she revealed about where the money actually went would lead to criminal investigations that would span 12 cities. If you believe veterans deserve immediate help, not bureaucratic delays, hit that subscribe button. If you think what these writers did, forcing accountability through peaceful assembly, is exactly right, comment veterans first. Because too many people look away when it's easier than confronting the truth. As news cameras capture the confrontation, a woman in a city employee uniform pushed through the crowd. Linda Morrison was 43 years old, had worked as a city budget analyst for 15 years, and had never spoken publicly about what she knew. She'd raised concerns internally, sent emails to supervisors, pointed out discrepancies in reports, and she'd been told, repeatedly, to focus on her assigned duties, to trust that leadership understood the big picture, to remember that whistleblowers rarely kept their jobs. But watching Michael Rodriguez stand in front of those cameras, watching him describe sleeping under a bridge while millions sat unused, something broke in Linda. The fear of losing her job suddenly seemed trivial compared to the weight of staying silent while veterans suffered. She was trembling as she walked forward, clutching a manila folder to her chest like a shield. "I have documents," she said, her voice barely audible at first. Then louder, stronger. "I have proof." Every camera swung in her direction. Mayor Carlson's face went from pale to ashen. Patricia Helms looked like she might be sick. Linda opened the folder, pulled out printed emails and budget memos, held them up for the cameras to see. $2.3 million in federal homeless veteran funding was allocated to this city 8 months ago, she said, reading from documents she copied at great personal risk. It should have been distributed immediately to veteran services, housing programs, mental health care. Instead, it's been sitting in an administrative holding account while city officials debated what they called creative reallocation. She pulled out more documents. Email chains, budget proposals, meeting minutes that should have been confidential, but that Linda had quietly preserved because she'd known this day might come. These emails show city administrators discussing how to delay distribution until the federal deadline passed. If they waited long enough, if they created enough bureaucratic obstacles, the money would revert to the general fund. They could use it for other projects that looked better on campaign materials than homeless veteran services. The crowd silence broke. Murmurs of outrage rippled through the assembly. News reporters shouted questions. The mayor tried to interrupt, tried to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. Linda kept reading. Budget memos discussing minimizing veteran visibility, so public pressure wouldn't force immediate distribution. Meeting notes where officials calculated how long they could delay before triggering federal oversight. Proof of intentional neglect. Proof that while Michael Rodriguez slept under a bridge, administrators were playing games with money designated specifically to help him. Mayor Carlson finally found his voice, stammering through a response that convinced no one. This is a complex issue with many stakeholders and competing priorities. These decisions require careful consideration of long-term impacts and sustainability. Reaper interrupted, his voice cutting through the mayor's deflection with brutal simplicity. It's not complex. You have money. They need help. Give them the damn money. The statement was so direct, so stripped of political doublespeak, that it landed like a physical blow. The mayor had no response that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. Excuses designed to protect administrators while veterans died. The news cameras captured his silence. Captured the moment when political calculation failed in the face of moral clarity. Captured the mayor realizing that this wasn't going away, that these veterans and bikers and cameras weren't going to accept bureaucratic excuses. Cornered, with 300 people watching and news helicopters overhead, Mayor Carlson did what politicians do when they have no other options. He made promises, live, on camera, commitments he'd have to keep or face consequences that would end his political career. The emergency funding will be released immediately, he said, the words coming out stiff and rehearsed even as he improvised them. We'll open temporary shelter in the vacant city administrative building on Market Street. 150 beds within 48 hours. We'll create a VA backlog task force to expedite benefits processing. Monthly public reporting on veteran services so the community can hold us accountable. Zero tolerance policy for benefit delays. The promises sounded good. Sounded like exactly what should have happened 8 months ago, without requiring 200 bikers in a public confrontation to force action. But Jake wasn't satisfied with promises from a man who'd let his brother sleep under a bridge while sitting on millions in funding. A reporter pushed through the crowd. Microphone extended toward Michael. What do you want people to know? Michael looked at the camera, at the thousands of people who'd eventually watch this footage, and spoke with a clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. I didn't ask to struggle, he said. I asked to serve my country. I did that. Did everything asked of me, and more. Now I'm asking my country to remember that service. Not with parades, or thank yous, or parks named after generals. With action. With housing that exists today, not in 6 months. With healthcare I can access now, not after I've waited so long I'm dead. With dignity. With the basic recognition that veterans are human beings who deserve better than sleeping under bridges while administrators debate protocols. The silence that followed was profound. Michael had articulated what every veteran in that plaza felt, what thousands of homeless veterans across the country experienced every day. The gap between the nation's rhetoric about honoring service and its reality of abandoning those who'd served. The documents Linda Morrison provided would trigger investigations in 12 other cities. Federal auditors would discover the same pattern. Homeless veteran funding delayed or diverted while administrators played bureaucratic games. The problem wasn't just one mayor or one VA office. It was systemic, built into structures that prioritized fiscal flexibility over human welfare. But what happened next proved that systems can be changed when enough people demand it. 3 months after 200 bikers surrounded City Hall, the city looked very different. The vacant administrative building on Market Street had been transformed into an emergency veteran shelter within the promised 48 hours. What started as a frantic conversion project, driven by political necessity, had evolved into something more comprehensive. 150 beds, dedicated intake staff, on-site mental health counselors, partnerships with local healthcare providers who agreed to prioritize veteran patients. The $2.3 million in federal funding had been distributed with a speed that proved it had never actually required 8 months of protocol development. Housing vouchers went out within a week, helping veterans secure apartments they could actually afford. Mental health services expanded, reducing wait times from 3 weeks to 3 days for emergency interventions. Job training programs launched, connecting veterans with employers who understood that service-related disabilities weren't liabilities, but evidence of sacrifice. The fast-track VA benefits program that administrators had claimed was impossible to implement took exactly 3 weeks to establish once political pressure made it imperative. Processing times dropped from 6 months to 3 weeks for initial determinations. Veterans still had to navigate bureaucracy, but the maze had been simplified, the dead ends eliminated, the deliberate obstacles removed. Local businesses, shamed by the exposure of how their city had treated veterans, stepped up with guaranteed interview programs. Didn't guarantee jobs, but guaranteed that every veteran applicant would get face-to-face consideration instead of being filtered out by automated systems or unconscious bias. Michael Rodriguez was among the first beneficiaries. Within a week of the City Hall confrontation, he'd been admitted to a VA mental health program. Not the overwhelmed, understaffed clinic that had told him to wait 3 weeks, but a specialized PTSD treatment center that understood combat trauma in ways that civilian providers couldn't. His therapist was Dr. Sarah Chun, herself a veteran who'd served in Iraq and understood firsthand what it meant to carry war home with you. She didn't ask Michael why he couldn't just get over it or suggest that time would heal all wounds. She gave him tools to manage the flashbacks, strategies to cope with hypervigilance, frameworks to rebuild a sense of safety in a world that had felt threatening since Kandahar. The housing voucher secured Michael an apartment. Nothing fancy, a 1-bedroom in a complex on the east side, but it had walls and a door that locked and a bed that wasn't under a bridge. The first night Michael slept there, he cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being warm and safe and having a space that was his own. Jake hired Michael at the motorcycle shop, started teaching him the mechanic's trade that had kept Jake afloat for 20 years. Michael had always been good with his hands, and working on engines gave him something to focus on, something concrete and fixable in a world that had felt broken beyond repair. But the most profound change came when Michael's daughter entered the picture. 8-year-old Emma, who who'd been living with her mother since Michael's homelessness made custody impossible, came back into his life. The court, seeing Michael's stable housing and employment and ongoing mental health treatment, had restored visitation rights with a path toward shared custody. The first time Michael picked Emma up for a weekend visit, the first time she ran to him and hugged him and said, "I missed you, Daddy," Michael understood why he'd survived the streets and the system and the despair. She was why. Every veteran's kid who needed their parent to come home whole. That was why the fight mattered. The ripple effect extended far beyond one city. Other cities, seeing the news coverage and the public pressure, started facing similar protests. Veterans and their supporters showing up at city halls demanding accountability. Federal auditors investigating delayed funding. Local news investigating VA backlogs. The problem that had been invisible became impossible to ignore. The state legislature passed what they called the Veterans First Bill, directly inspired by what happened when Jake made that phone call to Reaper. The law required immediate action on veteran homelessness, mandated that federal funding be distributed within 30 days of receipt, created criminal penalties for officials who deliberately delayed benefits, established oversight mechanisms to prevent bureaucratic games. The Hells Angels Brotherhood didn't disappear after the confrontation ended. They'd forced accountability, but they understood that one protest didn't fix systemic problems. They organized monthly stand-down events, bringing together veterans and service providers and volunteers to offer free services. Using the hook you generated for me. Now the goal is to use that hook and generate catchy text to video prompt, which I will use to generate 10 individualistic 11 seconds long clips that will capture the attention of my audience. While matching with the hook now, we are going to script the image prompt of each bit of the hook below at my order, each one giving a cinematic feel. Jake kept a photo on his desk at the shop, taken that Sunday morning by a news photographer who'd sent him a print without charge. 200 motorcycles in perfect formation surrounding City Hall. Michael standing beside him, homeless and broken in that moment, but about to be lifted by a community that refused to let him fall. The photo reminded Jake of how bad it had gotten, how close Michael had come to becoming another statistic. But it also reminded him of how fast things could change when enough people cared, when community action forced institutional accountability, when ordinary people decided that bureaucratic excuses weren't acceptable. Emma, Michael's 8-year-old daughter, had drawn her own version of that photo. Stick figures on motorcycles surrounding a building. An American flag flying overhead. Words written in crayon across the top. "The bikers saved my daddy." Michael kept that drawing in his apartment, looked at it every morning as a reminder of why he kept fighting. Not just for himself, but for every veteran's kid who needed their parent to come home whole. Every child who deserved to grow up with a father or mother who'd been given the help they'd earned through service. "She's why I keep fighting," Michael told the city council as he finished his testimony. "Not just for me, but for every veteran who's struggling right now. Every person sleeping under a bridge tonight while federal funding sits unused. Every Marine or soldier or sailor who did everything their country asked and then got abandoned by the very system supposed to support them. We can't let what happened to me become invisible again. We can't let bureaucracy win through attrition and public forgetfulness." Remember that bridge where Jake found Michael? The city had renamed it Veterans Memorial Bridge 6 months after the City Hall confrontation. And underneath it, installed during a ceremony that brought Jake and Michael and 200 riders back to the spot where everything had started, there was now a bronze plaque. 47 names etched in metal. 47 homeless veterans who died on the streets of this city in the past 5 years. Exposure, overdose, suicide, untreated medical conditions. Deaths that might have been prevented if the system had worked the way it was supposed to work, if administrators had prioritized people over protocols, if $2.3 million in federal funding had been distributed instead of deliberately delayed. 47 reasons why what Jake did mattered. 47 names that would have kept growing if 200 bikers hadn't surrounded City Hall and forced change. The plaque ended with words that Jake had helped write. "No veteran left behind. Not on our streets. Not on our watch." 1 year later, the homeless veteran population was down, but not eliminated. The VA backlog was reduced, but not solved. The system was better, but not fixed. There was still work to do, still veterans falling through cracks, Still administrators who saw people as problems to be managed rather than human beings to be served. But the city knew now that someone was watching. That the Brotherhood Jake had called upon that desperate Saturday morning hadn't disappeared, wouldn't forget, would show up again if the city started sliding back into old patterns of neglect. 200 motorcycles could surround City Hall again. And next time it might be 600 or 1,000, because the message had spread far beyond one city, one veteran, one desperate phone call. Marines don't leave Marines behind. And neither do people who understand that taking care of veterans isn't charity or politics, but fundamental obligation. That when someone serves their country, the country doesn't get to abandon them when service ends. That bureaucracy is never more important than human lives. That sometimes, when systems fail, regular people have to become the system. And that brotherhood, real brotherhood, means showing up when called. No questions, no hesitation. Just presence and solidarity and the absolute refusal to let another veteran disappear into statistics and excuses. That was the legacy. That was what 200 riders in one phone call had created. Not perfection, but progress. Not a solution, but a start. Not the end of the fight, but proof that the fight could be won when enough people cared.